Thank you very much. Just to introduce ourselves, it's more than just myself and Cordelia. The other students that we have with us today are Natalie Curran and Lizzie Harrison. And we have two other students who are not present today. One's in an exam and the other's had ill health. And that's the reality of working with students. But they have all contributed to the points that we're going to make. So I think the overarching problem that we want to kind of look at in terms of student perspective is that on the one hand, we have lecturers who want to produce content the way they want to produce content. And then we have students, on the other hand, who want to be able to use the content in their own way. And that use does depend on their level of digital capability as well. And of course, the thing that no one really talks about very much is the availability of the right infrastructure, without which you can't support the lecturers and you can't help the students easily. So in this session, we want to kind of cover off the student perspective. I'll go back a slide, the student perspective, and they'll also be talking about how they want to use content and how they want to kind of have their skills updated by staff. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Natalie and I'm going to show her slides. So Natalie.
Okay, thanks. Hi, yeah, so I'm Natalie, and I'm visually impaired, so yeah, registered blind, and I'm in the final year of a master's in mathematical finance to be precise, and it's not been easy. So because I'm working full time, it's an online course. I'm studying part time, and it's meant a lot of adapting. The biggest problem for me has been, and this has gone throughout all my studying at uni, the biggest problem for me is PDFs, to be honest with you. Academics really like PDFs, academia really likes PDFs, and there kind of seems to be a bit of an inherent resistance to changing that, or to opening up the potential to actually take things in different directions, maybe use a different file format, maybe actually embed accessibility into the PDF, because it is possible to make an accessible PDF if you want to, if you try. But we're talking about lecturers who have X amount of time to, cater to Y number of students. This is the way they've always done it, and I come along and start demanding something different. That kind of speaks to what Lillian's saying about infrastructure, and also having the digital tools and the capabilities to meet them halfway. So luckily for me, in some ways, I realized this was a problem in maths very, very early on. I was 13, and I discovered Unicode and computer maths, and I realized that there was a way for me to write in a way that I could read it fairly clearly as a screen reader, and that it present well in Braille, and that my teachers, and then when I got older, my lecturers could understand it. It wasn't their preferred method, and I think that's showing on one of the slides that Lillian's got here. Is so the version at the top is sort of the standard version, where you get superscripts and subscripts as you normally expect them, and then in my version is when you have symbols and everything to represent that placement. So it's maybe not as neat, but it does work more fluidly for forward and back translation. And I think Cordelia, who's going to talk after me, can tell you a bit more about how she's been the middle person for that. She's helped sort of link those two sides of the conversation for both me and my lecturers. But the thing that I really want to sort of drive home is that was my way of doing it. That was how I worked it out. There are other students who have other ways of doing it. I got very fed up in my first year, my first degree of philosophy, politics, and economics. I can't call that PPE now, and I mean something different. And there's a lecturer who was brilliant, but he kept saying, oh, we had a student who's just graduated, he did this, he did that, he did the other. And I said to him, look, that's wonderful. I'm not him. So I don't do the same things as he does. That doesn't mean I can't learn. It doesn't mean that this other student might have had some good ideas that I can copy. but don't assume just because that's the way they did it, that's the way I'll do it. And moreover, or more importantly, don't assume that just because that's the way they did it, that that's the best way to do it. I might come along and have a better idea, or vice versa. So yeah, we are people first, we are students first, we have a disability second. And on that note, I think I'll pass over to Cordelia.
Thank you, Natalie.
Hello, I'm Cordelia. I'm currently finishing a PhD in maths. I'm also a GTA, and as Natalie said, I've been helping her transcribe materials and supporting various other students. And for about the past 18 months, I've been working with Lillian on a kind of more university level to look at accessibility maths. First things first, just kind of taking a step back, how can we actually, what are the first steps people as teaching and lecturers should kind of consider when making documents from a student perspective? And actually the first one is just do the kind of basic accessible things that we should all be doing, regardless of the kind of what we're producing. Everybody wants an easy to read document. We should have headings and properly formatted lists. This makes things a lot easier to navigate. We should, as a matter of course, really just get into the habit of producing alt text, pictures, providing captions. We should have meaningful hyperlinks. We shouldn't have hyperlinks that say click here but don't tell you what you're clicking to. That isn't helpful at all. Saying things like, you know, hyperlink for this for presentation on universal design, for example, is a much more useful hyperlink than just click here. We should have tables that have clearly labeled rows. We should pick sensible fonts and have good color contrast, all the kind of obvious things that we should do every day, and most of us do, because otherwise we're producing things that are generally seen as not pretty looking and ugly things. Remember to do the basics is, I think, the first thing I want to say on this slide. Right, the next slide is what else can lecturers do kind of after that. So be prepared that you have a whole cohort of students, and these students will have different needs. So you may have, for example, a Natalie in your class. You'll have a vast majority of people who actually are okay with a PDF note. That will you know, suit their suit what they want, and how they want to interact with your course, but also appreciate that you may need to convert that file to different formats. It might be a simple changing from a serif font to a sans serif font. It might be sharing. It might be converting from a PDF, for example, to outputting with HTML. And I think later on today we will see various ways that this has been made easier. In LaTeX, for example, which is, I know, how lots of people produce at least maths notes. Both of these things can be done now if provided the documents produced nicely, not too much bother to the lecturer. You're not adding much more to workload there. I think also it's important as teachers and lecturers that we're also willing to experiment with new things, and be willing that if someone comes up to us and asks us to try something a new way, we should be willing to engage with that and try things a new way. And then lastly, in the kind of extreme case of the kind of Natalies of the world, be aware that there may be someone who's not in your class, a bit like me, who comes along and says, I'm doing this for this student who needs an extra step. I'm a support worker. And that support worker might actually need different things. They might need an intermediate step. When I'm translating, converting PDFs, for Natalie, it's actually really useful for me to have the raw LaTeX, which is not normally something lecturers share with students, but it makes my life as Natalie's support worker a lot easier if I can just have that kind of straight up LaTeX. Finally, Amy, who's currently in exam, so I will pretend to be Amy. We should be aware that students use different materials in different ways at different times. So when they're first coming across that material, they may want space to write notes, they might want to annotate notes, they might want to, you know, I know some lecturers like to have a kind of gap fill note version of the notes where you can write in the key information yourself. Then there are other times where students may want just to retrieve information. They're in a seminar or they're just doing a bit of homework, they might just want to look up a formula. In that case, they just want things to be easily navigated, and they might want easy access. They might even want easy access on a mobile phone. So having, for example, HTML notes rather than PDF notes are a lot more accessible and easy to read on a phone. So when you're on the go, or you're maybe just wanting to look up a quick formula, that can make a big difference to kind of everyone, just having 2 different versions at different times. And then, of course, particularly topical today at this time of the year, when people revise, they again want more condensed versions of notes. So actually producing your notes in maybe a variety of different ways can actually help students at different points of the course. But maybe the most important thing is just ask what students want, and be willing to maybe adapt as things happen. You're not going to ask each individual individually, but generally trends can be useful. Yes, and I think that's it. So I'm now handing over to Lizzie.
Thanks, Cordelia. Hi, I'm Lizzie, and I'm a first year joint honours maths and physics student, so I've got lots to be getting on with. It's interesting being a joint honours student because you sort of see the best of both worlds, but it also means twice as many academics to get to grips with, and that's something I'm going to talk about a bit later. But I also have a background in disability support and as a teaching assistant, as well as being a disabled student myself. So I'm going to kind of draw on both of those experiences while talking to you about accessible notes and things. So one of the things that I think gets overlooked in terms of co-producing with students and consulting with students is the skills that those students can develop in that process. And I'm not just talking about consulting with disabled students here, I'm talking about the wider cohort as well. I think there's a lot of advantages to discussing accessibility quite openly with your students and making them aware of why you're going through all this trouble to create accessible documents in HTML or whatever you're using. And actually, these students that we're engaging with are going to be future mathematicians and future physicists and engineers, and they're going to go on to engage with disabled people in the future. So it's really something that's important for your entire cohort to understand, not just your disabled students. And also, again, from my experience as a former teaching assistant, when you spend a lot of your time thinking about creating accessible documents and readability and accessibility, the way you present things is slightly different, and you have slightly more of an emphasis on clarity and really sort of engaging your brain as to why you're presenting something in a certain way. I, for example, get a lot of
Sorry, Lizzie, I don't know if you've accidentally muted. Still can't hear you, so. Shall I carry on for the next slide and hope that you can join back in, Lizzie? Okay, I shall continue for Lizzie. I'm sorry you can't hear her authentic voice, but I'm glad you've managed to hear a bit of what she's had to say. But yeah, I mean, the students have been telling us already that including students is so important. And whenever anything's being designed, that really asking students or having, we're not asking you to ask every single student, but making sure that you do touch base with some of the students to be aware of what works for them or what doesn't work for them, and then to communicate that back out to the entire student body, as Lizzie has already said. And this can help to reduce that individual burden on disabled students having to self-advocate for modifications. And one key point that Lizzie wanted to make was that because she has lessons from 2 different disciplines, well, maths and physics lecturers, she's getting such a wide variety of formats, and she's having to explain herself over and over again to so many staff about what works for her and why it works for her. So having a kind of universal design mindset in the beginning for all lecturers can be really helpful for her. Sorry, this was probably the slide that covered that point better. On the slide, you can see a variety of formats that Lizzie's typically having to kind of maybe consider. Not all of them are specifically maths and physics, some of them are economics in there. So having to kind of adapt constantly is extra tiring, on top of the fact that students have disabilities already. And then generally peer support can be really helpful. Again, Elsa's not here, but having things explained from a student perspective can be helpful. So bothering to organize peer support for the students. And finally, just encouraging everyone to talk to more students, because students are experts in their own lived experience. And when you've spoken to one student, you've just spoken to one student. It doesn't make any of us an expert, because, you know, we've worked with one particular visually impaired student. We have to treat every student as individuals. So these slides are available in our University of York Accessible Equations website. I'll pop the link in the chat after this, so I don't get in the way of Ben and Jim's. But once you get to the website, if you click on user stories, the slides are under the student perspective. And I highly recommend you also read some of the writings from our other staff and students on this site. And without further ado, I shall hand it back to the team.
Thank you, Lillian. And most importantly, thank you to the students. That was absolutely brilliant to hear from you.